All right, we're going to try to start on time here. We're going to start on time with Rethinking Teaching from the Inside Out. Before we dive in, we just want to try to get a sense of who is in the room with us this morning. So if you have a phone, please take it out, snap either the QR code on the screen or go to menti.com and enter in the code that you see. And we're just really curious, what is the role of the options provided that most closely describes your own? We know we have some school leaders or some school planners, a lot of organizational leaders of different organizational types. You know, we have some funders, perhaps some system leaders. Just give us a sense of who's in the room. All right, it looks like we have a large number of organizational leaders, large number of school leaders or school planners, a handful of funders, researchers, advocacy leaders, system leaders in the room. We're really excited to dive into this topic of rethinking teaching from the inside out. I'm first just gonna orient you all to what we'll be talking about. So I want to start by challenging an assumption. And that assumption is that when we talk about teacher turnover and stress, when we talk about student disengagement and student experience, that we tend to treat these as separate topics. So within schools and school systems, one is the domain of a people team, of HR. The other is the domain of academics or curriculum instruction. And really that's a false choice, though they're often treated as being separate with different strategies, different budgets, different conversations. The schools that you're going to hear from this morning are operating from a different hypothesis. That actually, as we design for student experience, we're simultaneously designing for adult experience and vice versa. And by taking that design decision, we get to better outcomes for students and better outcomes for educators. And so part of what's going to, I think, make this an interesting conversation, we hope, is that we're going to hear from three very different schools and school organizations. And I'll briefly introduce them, and then we'll turn things over to hear a little bit more about their models. Lara leads Internationals Network, is a nonprofit that supports district-run schools to support their newcomer students. Over 9,500 students in their direct-run schools across the country in 5 states. So not a charter network, an organization largely working within traditional district systems. Rafiq leads Ember Charter Schools in Brooklyn, New York. Very small, intentionally designed school, really grounded in a holistic view of human development. Peter leads Washington Latin, a classical charter school in DC, serving over 1,200 students in grades 5 through 12. And we have Aylon from Transcend, who's going to be helping us to make some connections across these different contexts. So 3 very different schools, but all have teacher retention rates north of 90%, student outcomes that outpace those of neighboring schools. And so while you'll hear very much difference in their pedagogical models, student profiles of who they're serving, we're going to get to some common trends. We're also going to try not to just agree on everything either. So as we get into the hour, we're going to do a little bit something that I'm going to call Skeptics Corner, where I'm going to offer up some skeptical takes on what they're going to describe, and we'll try to create a little bit of tension and some disagreement here as well. So with that, I'm going to ask each of the school leaders to briefly share a little bit about their model, and to do that by introducing us to a story, an image, a figure that kind of brings their model to life. And we'll start with Lara.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So I think when I heard this question, the first thing I thought of was the number 95. And that is where our last count was of the number of alumni that have graduated from our schools that have come back to serve as teachers, counselors, staff members, assistant principals, and we have our first principal as well of one of our schools. And so that's a number that kind of sticks with me. I'm not an alum, but I am a product of the model myself, and I was a teacher from one of our teacher teams. I grew into a leader. I'm one of dozens, my story is not unique, that lead our schools around the country. But I think of the story of my former assistant principal who came to this country and went to attend one of our first schools in Queens. She came from Colombia, and she was with her sister and her mother. And when she entered the school as a student, she was embraced by a teacher team, interdisciplinary teacher team that worked with her really throughout her school experience. Even when she got off track, even when it took her an extra year to graduate, her sister, who had gone to a traditional school, actually went with the statistics and dropped out of high school. So we serve a population that's 3 times more likely to drop out of high school when they arrive as older MLLs. But this teacher team actually drove her to college, dropped her off, encouraged her. And when she graduated, she decided she wanted to be a teacher. To give back to the community. And so I brought her in at the international school I had founded as a student teacher. And in the same way that when she was a young person and was embraced by a teacher team, as a student teacher, she joined a teacher team in our school, interdisciplinary teacher team that guided her, that supported her, that wanted to hire her when they had a spot on the team, and encouraged her when, in that first year, she was sometimes crying about how students were behaving, couldn't figure out how to design the curriculum, and she was invested in, just in the same way that she was as a young person, and grew into becoming the person that when I left, wanted her to be the assistant principal in our school. Just a few weeks ago, she has moved on to become a principal at one of our partner schools that's learning from us. Thank you.
Peace, everyone. So similarly, you're going to see kind of a bit of a theme here, right? Immigrants get the job done. So I'm going to talk about Brother Diamond. Brother Diamond. So our model is based on the way law firms function. We took the legal structure of this model and we brought it into schools with the core idea that practitioners should be the primary people making the decisions, but that won't really give you a good visual. So Brother Diamond, who came to us through a startup program that doesn't exist now called the Urban Teaching Corps, that was started in New York. If you know Miriam Rocca, she's dope. She started this program. It was underinvested. That's a whole nother panel though. But Diamond, they could not place him because he's from Senegal, and if you hear him, he has a thick accent. He speaks English, and you might think, like most people did, oh, well, he's not a master of the English language. How can we put him in front of kids? And I mean, that was to our benefit because we saw him and who he was. He talked in his interview with us about how he was picking through large piles of trash in Senegal for recycling to kind of help his family and support his family. And then here he was interviewing for this job to teach when he was supposed to go to law school. He had gotten his master's degree in criminology, and his family was saying, what are you doing? Why are you choosing this teaching career? And what we said to him in the moment, we said, well, you can tell them, they can rest assured, you are actually not choosing to be a teacher, because that's not what we're inviting you to do. We're inviting you to become this human developer. He was like, what in the world is that? I've never heard of it before. And it was this idea that at the heart of it, we are going to teach you to practice the craft in a very, very different way, where your experience of becoming is going to parallel and be intertwined with your students' experience of becoming. So they have to do reading, get reading assignments, so do you. Every day you have to learn something that you're unfamiliar with, they have to, so do you. And so Brother Diamond began as an apprentice. And just like our young people, when they come to us, he struggled with the texts we were challenging him to read. He had to learn neuroscience, which in none of his programs that he had been to asked him to do. He had to learn about mindfulness, which again, completely unfamiliar with that. He had to learn and read all of these different experts. It's like, and they say this all the time, it's like he was getting a PhD in a completely different subject matter than what he went to school for, which is what we ask our young people to do every day, starting at age 4 and 5. You show up, you don't know this, you will master this new thing. And so this parallel experience is the same thing that I went through when I went to law school. Law school does not prepare you to be a lawyer. Ask any lawyer, they'll tell you that. But the idea that you learn through practice. And so that's really at the heart of our model. So Brother Diamond began as an apprentice, struggled to connect, struggled to get the kids to listen. And so we had to tell them, well, you know, they can choose not to listen to you. What's the compelling reason that they should? How are you inspiring them to connect with you? And so Brother Diamond moved up through our ranks from apprentice to junior associate. And, you know, when he got to be junior associate, that meant that he got to be a lead practitioner. He got his own schoolhouse. It just meant the pressure mounted because the responsibility now for those young people, for those clients, and that's what we call them in our organization, those clients were now his. And then he spent the next 7 years guiding same group of young people up through our model. And so 2 years ago, this is now the beginning of his second anniversary, he is now a partner in our organization. He's a co-leader with me, and he makes all the decisions that we make in our organization, and that is delivering on the promise.
So before I start speaking, we do have some empty seats in the front. So if people want to move up, there are. There's a path this way.
There's a path this way,
right
through the
this
center.
way. Lots of seats in the front. So let's give you a moment for that. So you're going to hear some similarities between the three of us because I could also talk about alumni who work for us. I could also talk about us asking our adults to do some of the same things that we ask our students to do, including reading and challenging themselves and stretching themselves in new ways. However, what I'm going to start off with is the number 450. And that number represents the number of people who contributed to a GoFundMe campaign in the fall in less than 72 hours. And they were contributing to a GoFundMe campaign for our dean of students, our former dean of students, who was battling cancer. And we put this thing up on social media. His family had started this GoFundMe campaign and was hoping that people who knew him would want to support him in his covering his medical expenses. And like I said, in less than 72 hours, we had 450 former students, family members, faculty who had been impacted by this man. And that's not a fundraising campaign. That was 450 people who reached into their pockets because they had been touched by someone who had seen them, who had gotten to know them deeply, who always began by saying peace whenever he encountered them. And he shaped their lives in ways that they couldn't forget. He started out as a receptionist. And he greeted people every day, and then eventually moved into this position as dean of students. He had another job in between that, but it reflects who we are. We're a classical charter LEA. We serve 1,234 students, 4 schools, 2 campuses in Washington D.C. We've been around for 20 years, and one of the things that we say is that all of our adults, everyone's a teacher. And regardless of what role you play in the building, you are teachers. And part of being a teacher is about establishing these deep relationships, these connections, where you see the students. You truly see them for who they are, which is possible when you have small class sizes, when you have a small school, which is also an important part of our model. We're diverse by design. We are socioeconomically, racially, ethnically, and geographically diverse. That's also an important part of our model because we're a classical charter LEA, and our kids, they read Socrates and they read Toni Morrison. Well, I say they read Plato since Socrates didn't write anything, but they read Plato writing about Socrates, and they read the canon that is a diverse canon. And I'll say that what is important is to have this diversity in Socratic seminars where young people from different backgrounds are able to engage with each other on ideas. So we talk about us being a place where people matter, words matter, and ideas matter. And this notion of people mattering is reflected in the connection that people made to this dean of students. The story doesn't end happily. Unfortunately, he passed away in March. And at his celebration of life, the funeral home, they had this huge auditorium. In fact, I've never seen a funeral home with a space that big. But it was filled with former students. And they didn't find out. I sent the notice to the community on a Friday morning. The celebration of life was that Sunday, and the room was filled. And on social media, there were literally thousands of people who expressed their condolences and said, if I'd known earlier, I would have traveled. But people came from all over to really show their appreciation for how this man had impacted them. And it's about relationships, which is the reason why people stay with us, because of those connections. The reason why we have the retention that we have is because we really see people fully as full human beings, and they, in turn, see the students that they serve as full human beings. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. So we wanted to really start in concrete stories of people and individuals. We're going to try to pull up now, and Aylon's going to help us pull up. You've worked across hundreds of schools on redesign yourself and with your colleagues at Transcend. What's common across these three models, and what does the field seem to be getting wrong when it thinks about scaling and spreading the types of sort of practices at the heart of them?
The first word that comes to mind is just beauty. And I'm just struck by the stories. I heard them when we were, thinking about how we're going to share these ideas, but it was just so powerful to hear all three of those stories just now. So thank you. One of the things that I see across schools that we work with, and definitely in these stories, is the notion that we're designing, as you said at the beginning, Pete, we're designing for students and adults together. Whatever experience that the humans have in the school building was designed one way. And if we think that that experience is insufficient for some reason, we know we can design it another way. And so not only in these examples do we see a different kind of design, but we see a design that is not siloed. And I think that is, if I could only make one observation, it would be that the question was not, how do we need to change the teacher role? That was not the question. The question was, how does the experience of all the humans in this building need to be different? And yes, centering the students, right? Because that's kind of the first principle, is that it has to be good for the kids. But with a recognition that it can't be good for the kids unless it's good for the adults. And a recognition that maybe the poor design choices that are held by the industrial model of school, or whatever you want to call it, are equally trapping young people and adults. And so when I think about, for example, how in Lara's story, 95 people came back to work for the place that they were students at, they were coming home, right? And that means that home was created. And that's not necessarily how school's designed right now, right? Nowhere in the factory model in 1907, when they got around and said, let's use the Taylorist factory principles to design school, did they say, let's make this feel like home, right? Where it was important to have connection and community where the whole child was centered. We heard that in all of the stories. Where in some cases, in Diamond's story, young people have agency, right? They don't, what the words you said, Rafiq, were they don't have to listen to you. They have a choice, right? That's not a common design choice in the industrial model of school. Certainly when I went to talk to my daughter's 4th grade teacher in January because she was talking too much, she did not have the option, right? When her teacher said, I say Rosie's name 25 times an hour. And I was like, I'm also sorry, but also maybe she's not challenged. Okay, anyway, I digress. And then in the story of a community coming together in tragic circumstances, like that is created, and you actually connected it all the way back even to the to Socrates, right? Like these are the principles that drive the experience that create that warmth and that connection. And so that's probably my number one observation, is that we're designing school for both the young people and the adults at the same time. And I see too many examples where we silo those, where actually we do think about the students and feel like, great, and forget about, well, there are humans here who need to facilitate this. How is it for them? I myself participated in some of that as, a staff member at Teach for America, as a, leader of charter networks, where it's like 13 hours a day, work, like, great, whatever, it's for the kids, right? It's like, well, no, that doesn't actually work. Right? Every time we get on a plane, it says secure your mask before assisting others, right? Like you got, and so I think we're now learning our way into this, but I also don't want to make the mistake of then designing for the adults without designing for the kids. None of these examples are doing that, but I do think that in our top-down kind of like fix the problem sort of way, we do risk, if we're not careful, swinging the pendulum the other way.
I'll invite Peter, Rafiq, Lara, sort of respond to what you heard from Aylon. What if it resonates? What might you push on?
So, talk about structure and principle. And we have the principle that everyone is an educator. But the structure about how that shows up is totally context dependent. So at Washington Latin, our structure we don't have rigid role hierarchies. Our receptionist became our dean, our business manager became our athletic director. And every adult has meaningful engagement with students, including, I teach a financial literacy class, and I co-teach one section of that with my CFO, just as a way of making sure that we are doing two things there. We're centering the students. The students are getting the experience of working with people who understand the subject matter, but we're also reminding the adults, whatever role that they play, that they are first and foremost serving students. So whatever your role is in the organization, that's what you're doing. The principle is that every adult who works with students shapes student outcomes and should be empowered to do so. And that is something that is applicable wherever you are, regardless of your model, regardless of your approach. And I could think of that happening in a district school, for example, where there may be some constraints. It could be instructional aides co-planning with teachers instead of just supervising lunch. In a larger network, it might be creating leadership pathways for non-credential staff that might demonstrate mission alignment. So the principle is, if you believe the work matters, you get to contribute to the work. And it will look different depending on your situation, your context, but that I think is applicable broadly.
Yeah, and what you hear Peter describing is this mutuality, right, in the experience between the adults and the young people in this place we call school. Because if we honestly just thought we could stop calling it school for a second and we start thinking about what is the experience we want young people to have as they emerge into their adulthood. And if we instead ask that question, then the very humans responsible for curating that experience would be evolved in a very similar mutuality. And so fundamentally, the way we think, we very similarly, we say everyone's a human developer in our organization. Everyone gets the same training, everyone. operations team, dean's team, apprentices, everyone gets the same training. There are some defined roles, right? There are people who are responsible when the bus shows up, they're going to go out there and greet them. But who does it on any particular day? Someone might be in a conversation with the caregiver, so someone else can step in to do it. The language that we use, how we talk with each other. In the same kind of practices around response inhibition, around how do you deal with conflict, we don't say, well, this is how kids deal with conflict. We say this is how humans deal with it. So what happens is we frequently hear, you know, my marriage, my relationship is different as I've been at Ember. I'm asking more questions, which is not always well received. So don't, you know, it's not always well received, right? They're like, why are you doing all that breathing while we talking? Like, you know, they're like, I'm taking a mindful minute. Like, all that stuff happens. But this, we say to people all the time, you cannot teach it if you do not live it. It has to be your practice. And so in that is another, and I know Pete wants us to disagree at some point, which we will, maybe, but the truth is, like, that mutuality to me is essential about if we're going to really reimagine this craft altogether.
Yeah, I think, you know, we didn't all know each other, right? I didn't know you all. And then when we started talking about our case studies, all these similar themes emerged. And so in our network, we have a number of core principles that really ground the instructional work in classrooms. And one of them is called One Learning Model for All. And our teachers always say that that's one of their favorite, it's always one of mine, core principles. It's also one of our design principles for schools, and it's what we work on with schools and school leaders. And it's the idea that what we ask students to do as learners, we do ourselves as adults, right? So, and that can be, our classrooms are collaborative teamwork classrooms, just like our adults are collaborative teams that are working together to support the young people that they share. We ask students to do performance assessments and portfolios. Our adults do performance assessments and portfolios with each other, teachers. We have students give each other peer feedback. We do peer intervisitation. So all of those pieces are things that, like, our teachers are learning along the way, and they're also learning about what's hard about the things that they're asking students to do. And through that, we continue to grow and invest in all the people in our building.
So I think there's a really powerful sort of thread there around mutuality, is how you described it, Rafiq, around sort of the mirroring of adult experience and student experience. I've had the privilege of being at each of your schools, and like, it's very real. It's not just in the words, it's in like the lived experience of educators and students, where they're talking about sort of development, they're talking about learning in very similar ways, like mirrored throughout the system. It's really incredible. Now we're gonna shift some gears to what I'm gonna call like the skeptic's corner, all right? And I got 4 skeptical takes on what you all have described, and I'm gonna share those skeptical takes and wanna sort of get into some disagreement, perhaps, at least disagreement with the skeptical takes. You still might agree with each other. But the first of them is like, all right, so these are beautiful models, as Aylon said. They're boutique. Small schools, charter flexibility, exceptional founders. It's not replicable. And so, while admirable, and it's incredible what's happening here, it's not scalable. That's objection number 1, critique number 1. Number 2, there are a set of systemic conditions that prevent these types of ideas and these types of practices from reaching more educators and more students. Union contracts, state policy, budget and resource constraints. So what works in sort of a protected pocket doesn't survive in the real conditions of schools across this country. Number 3, collaborative cultures. Makes it harder to maintain high standards, that rigor and relationships maybe don't quite exist, and you have to choose sort of one. You can't have both collaborative cultures and real accountability for high standards and results. I'm not saying I agree with these, I don't, but I'm just putting it out there. All right, here's the last one, also not one that I agree with, but I'm gonna put it out there. We're having the wrong conversation, because AI is about to and is already fundamentally shifting the way that students learn and educators work and how schools need to be organized. And so this is just kind of an outdated conversation if we're not also talking about the two letters AI that haven't yet been mentioned in this entire conversation. So that's the AI critique. We got to like minute, whatever, 30 something. We haven't talked about AI yet. Those are my four critiques, thank you. I'd like to invite reactions.
I'm going to take the first, though all of us were like, we take them all, but I'm going to take the first one. So I'm going to talk to you all really briefly about this guy named Paul Cravath. Paul Cravath is credited as the name founder, though he wasn't the founder of this law firm that's been around about a little less than about 200 years. Paul Cravath, when he graduated from Columbia Law School, he got two clients. One guy named George Westinghouse. For those of you who don't know, like Westinghouse, it was him, the Baron. And then the other guy, this really smart guy who was really terrible at business, named Nikola Tesla. And these two clients, in particular, were battling with the Elon Musk of the time, Thomas Edison. And so Cravath, Paul, had this different idea about how to build his law firm. The law had been practiced for centuries in one particular way, how you became a barrister, how you became a lawyer, which we inherited from England. It had been practiced one particular way, literally for centuries. And he had this different idea that actually, if you focused on the practitioner and the development of junior practitioners like he was, and you focus in on hiring and developing those people, you actually are going to be the best service provider in the industry. Now, this was unheard of at the time, but he started with a value, and that value drove a systems change. Now, what you should also know about Paul Cravath and about the value that drove him and his human-centered approach, even back then. Now, if you ask people in the legal field about Cravath, Swain, and Moore, this is the most prestigious law firm in the world. And I'm not saying this because I worked there, not because I was associate, but you can ask anybody, because I did. But what they did was to change dramatically the practice of law in this country and around the world. And it started with this articulation of these values and these ideas, that if you centered on the practitioner. And so when people say this, well, it's small and bespoke, we simply value different things. And if we all start to value different things, and we establish what that is, that's how the system change will really emerge. Last point about Paul Cravath. Paul Cravath's father was a pastor, was a reverend. And right after the Civil War, he founded an HBCU, Fisk University, which no one knows. No one knows that Paul Cravath and Cravath has funded this university since its inception and started. Because it, again, is about what they valued, and what they believed is what we all believe. Given the opportunity and the resource, whoa, watch these humans thrive.
Thank you. I think, what I always say is we work in districts, right? We've always worked in districts. Our first school opened 40 years ago. Our organization grew out of our schools because of our investment in young people and the adults through the teaming work. We're actually building people in the system that become agents of change. They develop agency. They're the ones who are moving into leadership positions and changing policy. They're the ones who are calling their union and saying, actually, for the first time, I have a voice. I'm making decisions at the school. This is something that we should all be thinking about. So I think when people say that, it's, maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, but I think, you need to have the will, you need to have the imagination, and you need to build from the bottom up. You need to build those voices, those young people. When I think about the teachers that I was with 30 years ago when we were sitting around a table developing the schools, all of us have become leaders, we've become principals, we've become system leaders, and we're not just in one system, we're across the country.
So I'll take the point about lack of accountability in collaborative cultures. And sometimes people will say that, when you have shared leadership, you've got consensus-driven decision-making. And if you've got consensus-driven decision-making, you can't get rid of poor performers because everyone has a vote. That's not exactly the case. So shared leadership doesn't necessarily mean distributed authority. It means distributed responsibility. People have roles. And when you have a high trust collaborative culture, underperformance is often more visible because when you've got weekly collaborative planning meetings, you see who's done their work and who hasn't. When people are going in and out of each other's classrooms, they know who is prepared and who isn't, who's pulling their weight and who isn't. Whereas in a more top-down structure, often an underperformer can coast for years. And so the idea here is, yes, there might be shared responsibility, but I'm the head of schools, I'm the CEO. I can still get rid of someone who is not performing well. And while there is input, and while we value the contributions of other people, that doesn't mean that we let underperformance slide. In fact, what often happens in that environment is the underperformer recognizes their underperformance before he gets flagged by a supervisor, and they either choose to get help, which they can get in an environment where people are willing to collaborate and support and are invested in them not just as professionals and as practitioners, but also as people. And so people are much more willing to actually support that. They either go and get help that they need, or they decide this is not the right fit for them. And so often they are making that decision, exercising that choice without having to be forced out. Now, there are times when we have to tell people they got to go. We've done that, and it works. However, I do want to share that this is not, the top-down approach doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually being more accountable or that you're being more responsible.
And I get the AI one. So the objection was AI is going to change everything anyway. Why are we having this conversation, basically? So a couple things. One is that when we center student experience, as we talked about, humans and tools can all be in service of that experience. And if we want the experience to be more connected, more agentic, more rigorous, there are ways of leveraging human capabilities and technological capabilities to do that. And I hope we do, because that one point about the mutuality that I want to bring out for a moment is there's actually a beautiful symmetry between the more that the students are carrying the load, the more the teachers can have a better job, right? Like it's part of the problem with the teaching role as it is now is that we got more goals of what teachers should do without ever changing the design. So, at some point it was like, well, you just, reading, writing, arithmetic, whether they learn it or not, because it's actually the kids' fault if they don't learn, so whatever, right? That was the beginning. At that point, the teacher job was a lot more doable, right? Then I was like, no, all kids could learn, so make sure they all learn. Then it's like, no, not only could all kids learn, but they need to learn at the Common Core level. And by the way, we haven't changed anything about the way we do school, right? And now actually like whole child and social emotional learning, and they need to be in their executive state, and so you need to make sure to have a wonderful grading unit come in there. We just keep adding and adding and adding and adding, right? And we're never transferring some of that to young people or to other tools. And so I think that's where AI comes in, is that it gives us the ability, if we design right, to unlock a lot of things, but it does not replace. There's like literally no one, even on the, when Kim Smith, if you were in the opening session, they're like the people like, AI is going to solve anything. And then there's like, get the screens out. Even the Mountainhead people are not saying, just literally get the matrix goggles and go, right? Like that's not the the thing. Everyone knows we need humans in the systems. And so it becomes a game of, and a puzzle. It's a really awesome puzzle of like, what are the jobs to be done in the student and adult experience, and how does AI help with that? And so I think it's very relevant to have this conversation because we're talking about how do we design the student and adult experience, and the existence of another tool does not change that conversation. It's worth reminding us that if we had the NewSchools Venture Fund Conference in the year 1960, we'd be having a panel about, isn't television just going to change education? And literally that's what people were saying and thinking, right? And then fast forward to 1982 and Apple computers, and that was supposed to change the way we do school, didn't. Then the internet, then ed tech products and personalization, right? Like we just keep thinking the tool will be the solution, and AI is going to be no different. It's more powerful, so we can screw it up even worse. But also it's more powerful, and we could harness it for good, because there are many, many jobs to be done that AI can do that make the student experience better and make the adult experience better. I can give examples, but I'll leave it there.
We want to take an opportunity now to turn it all to you. So we're going to put up on the screen in a moment another Menti, which will be an opportunity to type in some questions for the panel, and we'll select some of those questions to ask up here. But as we do that, take a moment to turn and talk to your neighbor. What's coming up for you? Take a couple minutes for that. And when you see the Menti up on the screen, you can pull out phones and type in a couple questions. But first, quick turn and talk. What's coming up for you as you listen to our speakers? Okay, we're going to come back together. We're going to bring it back together for a few questions before we close out the session. Okay. We have some folks that added some questions. Please feel free to keep adding. We will not have a chance to get to all these questions, but by adding them, we can get a sense of what's on folks' minds. I'm going to start with a question here about school administrators, or I think also system administrators. So the question is, administrators nationwide are focused on isolated metrics at scale. How can you convert mindsets to value human-centered approaches? How do you speak the language of administrators and make this shift?
That's a $1 million question. It's a great one. I think that there's not an easy answer to it. And because it is a learning journey and an unlearning journey. And so to the extent that we've seen any success in changing hearts and minds in these directions, it hasn't been through like argument, but it's been through experiences actually for those administrators, right? So you'll be surprised to know how few administrators or even teachers, frankly, unless it's a priority for that community, spend 45 minutes talking to a young person where they only talk for 3 of the minutes. And that is an eye-opening experience, let alone shadowing a student for an entire day. Or and pairing that with, let's actually look at the science of learning. What does it say about the kind of experience that young people need to have, about the kind of experience that adults need to have? And so in a phrase, I would say the only way to do it that we've seen any success is by exposing, and they have to be willing to do it, but many are, exposing them to a learning journey where they are actually changing their own perspective and maybe letting go of some of the things that have made them successful, which is kind of the hard part sometimes. But I have faith in that because I have faith in humans in general, but also because I've literally seen it happen. I've seen the transformation where and by the way, it doesn't look like, oh yeah, now reading doesn't matter. No, it's like now I have a new conception of, I'm seeing in 3D. And I do think we need to pay attention to that. I will say that I'm seeing less effort and money go to that kind of leadership development than maybe we've had in the past. And I think that's a mistake. And if I were a billionaire, I would do it differently. But I'm not.
Can
I'd be
I
a good
add-
billionaire, though, I just want to say.
Yeah, can I add one more thing to that? I think that we're going to have to ask people to increase their courage, because this is not a riskless endeavor, right? Changing systems where the whole infrastructure, from philanthropy to authorizers to politicians, has been built around the same set of metrics for a very long time. And it's going to require us to take some risk and invite them into their courage. You know, we talk about the inspiration gap that exists for teachers and for students, but for that administrative class, I think that also, there's a gap there. And so the invitation to lean into inspiration as a way to fuel their courage is, I think, another way for us to get at this question.
And bring them together.
Yes.
I would say, I mean, I think that's also what happens. Administrators are isolated.
Yes.
And they don't always know what's possible.
Yep.
Right? And so how are you bringing administrators together to see what's possible and to work together to make that change?
I'll just say really quickly, when our CFO, who I mentioned earlier, started working with students, she was very apprehensive. She's like, I'm not a teacher. These kids are going to eat me alive. And she wasn't by herself, but she made some connections with students that completely shifted her mindset and really changed the way she looked at the budget. And so that kind of, this idea that all people, including administrators, teach, which there's a lot of resistance to. There's this thing that I hate where people say, well, I want to leave the classroom because I want to escape the classroom in some way. And we want to try to bring people back into the classroom.
So there's one question here on tangible levers. I'm just going to note that in a moment we'll put up a slide with a QR code out to some case studies for each of these schools that actually folks on Aylon's team helped to work together with school teams to produce. And so that'll give you a chance to go deeper into some of the really concrete, tangible levers that each of these schools are using. But I want to actually end on a question around advice that you have for individuals that's also up here. And the question is, what advice do you have for supporting traditional public schools to get closer to creating schools and classrooms that move away from traditional and rigid models? Like, let's say you're a school leader in this room or you're a system leader in this room. What advice would you have for them about like where to start? Like, what's a concrete step that you can take if you're thinking about this kind of shift?
I guess I'll start. I mean, we always start with teams. Build a teacher team. And have them experience the kind of learning that you want to see in classrooms. So one of the first things we do with our teacher teams is we have them sit in, and experience a classroom where the teacher is, where they're being spoken to in a language that they don't understand. And then we have them experience it when it's a collaborative environment, right? Where students are actually learning, where they're actually able to work together around something. We also give them something really authentic to work on together so they understand collaboration. So have them design a project together, their first interdisciplinary project. It may not be very good, but that's okay, right? That's their first experience, just like young people in the classroom. So give them those authentic learning pieces, but also build your first team.
Yeah, I would just echo that by saying, ask questions and then actually do something with the answers and responses. Start there. When you ask them, well, what do you think? Whether it's an idea you love or not, actually move to implement. And that's going to invite everyone to start to use their imagination in a way that they may not have given themselves permissions. We were talking about just a few minutes ago. So many people just don't think they have the permission to reimagine. And so I think by asking questions, what do you think we should do? And then do something with that response.
So I would say clarify the beliefs that are most important, the beliefs that align with your mission. And these are not just beliefs about how to teach math or reading, but what are the fundamental beliefs about how kids learn, fundamental beliefs about what school is for, fundamental beliefs about how people should be connected with each other. Clarify those beliefs, identify how those beliefs align with your mission, and then hire for mission. You can teach skills, but you really want people who are aligned with their mission, who have the beliefs that can drive the actions. A lot of times we focus on the actions first, and really when things break down, it's because there is a belief, and it could be a pedagogical belief, but it might actually be a much more fundamental human belief that you have to actually get to the root of. And that's where I think you should start.
All wonderful and very connected ideas, and great ways to start. So maybe I'll add, once you've started, make sure that the student experience and engagement is at the center of all the conversations. And because this is not a one-time activity, right? That we probably didn't spend enough time talking about how all of this evolved over years and years, and it's actually going to look different watching Lara in 2 years than it does today. Based on understanding, measuring, attending to, listening to what the students are experiencing and feeling, and what the adults are experiencing and feeling, and making design decisions as a result. So I guess I would say one of the imperatives that I think we all have is something that Oliver said on the stage, actually, which was, I'll paraphrase, but this notion that we have to continuously evolve the way we do school. And that's another part of the core design of school today that is not native to it, is that it's not meant to be redesigned over and over and over again year after year, which maybe is why we're not so good at it. And so my advice would be to take seriously the notion of what would it mean and what would it look like for us to have that ongoing muscle to be responsive to external world, AI's here, jobs are different, et cetera, but also internally what's happening here in our learning environment, in ways that are inclusive of everyone in the ways that we just talked about.
Join me in thanking all four of our speakers here this morning. We really appreciate it. I mentioned if you want to learn more about any of these three models, you can check out that QR code and download those from a site on the NewSchools website. I think there's also contact information in those cases as well. And we'll be up here for anybody that wants to sort of come up and chat afterwards. I know lunch is starting in just a couple of minutes, I think downstairs in the room where breakfast occurred. Hope everybody has a great rest of the day, and thank you again for joining us.